This is a first interview with David Driskell for the Getty Research Institute's African-American Art History Initiative in association with the Oral History Center at UC Berkeley. The interview is being conducted by Bridget Cooks and Amanda Tweez at Mr. Driskell's home in Hyattsville, Maryland on April 12th, 2019. So thank you both for sitting with us today, and Bridget, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, so David, we're starting right at the very beginning. So could you tell us when and where you were born?
I was born in Eatonton, Georgia, which is in Putnam County, not very far from Macon, Georgia. 1931, and I lived there for the next 5 years before my family moved to Appalachia in western North Carolina.
And you were born on June 7th, so your birthday's coming up.
Yes, I was born June 7th, and my father at that time was an AME minister, my mother a homemaker, and I was actually, the record shows that they were 4 Driskell children. So I was actually the 5th, but the first son died. He was born a year ahead of me, and he died 2 or 3 days after birth. And obviously there was this great excitement when I was born June 7th. They're having 3 daughters ahead of me. And I was told by my mother, my father never told me this, but I was told by my mother that 3 days after I was born, that my father, against her wishes, took me out of her arms and took me into the church, which was immediately next door. In those days, what they called the pastorate was next door to the church. There was the pastor's house, the church, the cemetery, sometimes the school. In this case, a little one-room school, not much larger than this room, for black kids. So I was told that he took me out of her arms and said I must take him into the church, to the altar, and offer him up to the Lord. And my mother never saw Ruth's, but she indicated that this was some kind of practice that they did in their family. And I tried to make it into a Ruth's situation by saying, did he give me a name? And she said, yes, your name was King David. I said, oh, no. And I said, is that on record? She said, yes, it's on record. And I said, well, I wanted to obliterate it. I wanted to take it off.
So your official legal name was King David?
It's not on my birth certificate.
Okay.
But that's what she said. And I said, no, absolutely not. But
okay.
It's not on my birth certificate,
okay.
Thank heavens.
And so do you have any memories of Eatonton, or do you have, are your first memories there, or are they in North Carolina?
No, I have vivid memories of Eatonton.
Okay.
And they tell me they go back to 2.5 to 3 years,
wow.
Based on what I've told them about it. And I guess it's accurate. My sisters never confirmed it. They said I took all the sense from them. How could that happen? I was born after you. And because I've always had a pretty good memory. But I remember, I don't remember the house near the church, but I do remember the second place where we moved in the community. And we moved to, we were renters, of course, so we moved to a little house near the brook down from Mrs. Walker's home. Mrs. Walker was we thought she was well off, one of the few African Americans in the town that we thought may have been well off. She was the grandmother of Alice Walker.
Wow.
And they were attendees at my father had two churches in the little town. I was born at the site of Hunt's Chapel, AME Church. But he also had a second pastorate across town, in the second black community across town, which was Ward's Chapel. Now, Hunt's Chapel is still in existence. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but when the people from the Arts Council of Great Britain came to film me in 1989, they took me back there. Actually, they asked me ahead of time. They said, "What do you remember about this place?" And I told them about the town, the square, and I told them where the church was. I told them all of these things I remembered. They went down 2 weeks ahead of me and found things exactly as I described them to them. It seemed like time had stood still. And except Ward's Chapel is the second church, they're trying to restore it, but it's really all but gone. But I mentioned that because I mentioned Mrs. Walker, Alice Walker's grandmother. She had one of the largest houses in town, as I recall, as a child, and it had a big white fence around it. And we didn't have running water. They did. Mrs. Walker had running water, electricity. We didn't have electricity. And we used water, we got water from a spring. Some people said artesian well. It was a spring, it was just popping up out of the ground. And it was a neighborhood, community spring. And we'd all meet there and get water. And I remember the kind of joyous experience of going across the green with my mother to get buckets of water, bringing it back to the house.
And that's all in Eatonton, so you
all
were...
in Eatonton.
So you were very young.
I had to be no more than 3 years old, because we then moved to a second house on the other side, the better side of town, if you call it that. And we moved into a 2-story house. You couldn't use the upstairs because it was in disrepair. And so, but we as kids would climb up because you could look out the window. And my mother was domestic, so we could see her coming. And oh, here comes Mom. And we want to know, what is she bringing home? Because she would work for 50 cents a week during the Depression, of course, and tote whatever she could tote home from these people's houses, biscuits, meat, and fruit and stuff like that. We were anxiously waiting for her to bring tote. So that was the second part of area where we lived. We didn't have a garden, which is also interesting to me, because as I remember, some of the other neighbors had gardens. But see, my father was away a lot, in and out with his ministry. And the thing I remember most about that was $1 a day. You had to scrape up $1 somehow or another to give, so it would go to the bishop. And who could afford $1 back then? A loaf of bread was 5 cents.
And your mom is making 50 cents a week, so that's half a month's wages.
Yeah. But we lived on that. We didn't live well, but we lived on it over the years. My sisters went to school. I didn't go to school there. And there was this little one-room school down from the church, which I visited again in 1989 when they brought me there. It's not in use any longer. And there was there are 2 cemeteries at Hunt's Chapel. There's the ancient cemetery, I called it, where, because the church in 1989 was 125 years old. So that meant that that church was there pre-slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So we called it the Slave Cemetery, which was adjacent to the house and the little school where we lived. But the new cemetery is on the north side of the church. And I'm rambling, but my second sister, Verdi, who was born in 1926, they had all these notions about somebody would come in and look at the child and say, that child's going to be so and so and so. That child was born with the veil. That child will be knowledgeable. And they said about me, oh, he's going to be very bright, you know, and blah, blah. Anyway, Verdi's, the second daughter, was supposedly born with the veil, and she could see spirits, she could see things.
And was that true for her?
Well, she, without any knowledge of, because in those days nobody talked about slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody talked about Africa. Those were like forbidden subjects. But she would, I'm told, that in the evening she would come running back in the house. Because the house was here, the cemetery was there, saying, those folk with the chains are out there.
No.
And my mother tells the story. My older sister, all of the three sisters are deceased now, but all of them told the story of how Verdi would come running in the house, seeing the people out there with the chains at dusk. So they would say she was born with the veil.
Mm-hmm.
So I came up with those stories, which were oral, scary, and yet, from the point of view of heritage, when I became older, I wanted to know what was that all about. But then mouths were closed. Nobody, you don't talk about that because it isn't proper. It isn't good company. So I got very little of it, but somehow or another I knew it. And when I'd ask these these questions about Africa, my father's father, we called him Papa. He was a little Geechee man, little Gullah man. Spoke with an accent and so on. And we said to my father, why does Grandpa talk so funny? Because he'd say man for man, and he called peanuts goober and things like that. And we had to really get reacquainted with what he was talking about to understand. But he was a very bright man, very interesting. He had the equivalency of a third grade education, because I guess he was born right after slavery. We never knew the exact date. We do know the lineage of his father, who was Douglas Driskell, who must have been born in the 40s, 1840s or so.
Wow.
And then John Driskell, who must have been born around 1820. We don't think in Africa, but because the names are still Driskell, not. Papa died 1949, the year I graduated from high school. And I last saw him in 1948 when he came to North Carolina to my aunt Verdi Lee's funeral. My sister was named for that aunt, which was very common in those days. And by today's standards, I guess you would say he was very sexist. Because he said to, and I read a letter that he had a beautiful penmanship. Everybody say I write like him, you know. He wrote the letter, which I wasn't supposed to read, which said to my dad in 1947, so I guess I would have been in the 11th grade or something, 10th or 11th grade. He said, don't waste your money trying to educate your girls. All they're going to do is get married. He said, save your money and send your boy to school. I never let them know that I read that.
Right.
And they didn't have any money.
Right.
But it was literally pretty much post-Depression, you know. And we were at that time sharecroppers in North Carolina. But he came up and he surveyed the situation. And he said, no, don't try and send your girls to school. Save your money and send your boy to school.
Did your sisters go to school?
No.
They didn't.
They did exactly what he said. They got married early. And so he was kind of prophetic in a way. But I'm getting off the subject. But
let me look at some of these other things I wanted to make sure that you spoke to us about. So your dad was a minister. He had 2 churches at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So he had to preach at both of them every Sunday?
No, every other Sunday.
Oh, every other
First Sunday
okay.
at Ward's Chapel, the second Sunday at Hunt's Chapel, third Sunday at Ward's Chapel,
Okay.
back and forth.
Wow.
And even when he later he left the Methodist Church and became Baptist, and he did the same thing.
At 2 churches.
He had 3 at one time.
Okay.
He would preach at one church twice. Preach at 2 churches nearby on the Sunday.
So, why did you leave Eatonton, Georgia to go to North Carolina? Was it because of opportunities for him?
They thought, family-wise, the opportunities were greater because we had family who had already moved to North Carolina, to western North Carolina, to Appalachia, to Cleveland and Rutherford County. They actually had moved to Rutherford County. And they became sharecroppers and farmers. And that's when we weren't sharecroppers in Georgia. I've heard people, kind of amplify it and say, born a sharecropper in Georgia. No. Weren't born a sharecropper in Georgia. Became sharecroppers later. Wasn't born in a hospital. Midwife, we called her Ma Smith, who came and made the delivery for all of us. So moved to North Carolina because 1936 because the opportunities were supposedly better. I'm not sure that I agree, but my mother had a sister, May Ethel, who left Georgia, not Eatonton. They didn't live in Eatonton. They lived in Jasper County. She left early, and they moved to North Carolina.
Okay.
And to them, this was the promised land. Now, something that we were never able to totally check out and make sure that it was accurate. But on my mother's side of the family, the Clouds, C-L-O-U-D, they had, as most African Americans say, we had Native American blood and so forth. I don't know how much blood was there. I just remember Grandma Hahn, as we call her, my mother's mother, was a little lady of fair complexion with long hair. Very wise when it came to talking about what you eat, what to make medicine from, and things like that. And so the association was with Cherokee people, but she didn't call herself, Cherokee or anything like that. But they had certain traditions which obviously indicated that there was this origin. The name Cloud, and the first 5, she had 10 children. The first 5 were named for things, and the the first child was Good Cloud. And so all we knew was Aunt Good. Later, we learned that she had to have a Christian name, so it was Essie. The second child was Sat Cloud, like sat on a cloud. And the third child was Sweet Cloud. And so that tradition was in the family. We didn't know why, but later on we learned why, because they did have this association. And the story is that in the 20s, they had a large body of land, but it was taken, just literally taken by force, and they could get no legal help to get it back or anything. And so they left. They just packed up and left Georgia, came to North Carolina, and settled over near the Cherokee Reservation.
I see.
Not too far from Asheville, so Rutherford County.
I see.
And Henderson County, Buncombe County. Buncombe is where the Cherokee Reservation is. So, you know, you'd have to think about it to put all that together. But as I look back on it, you know, and I don't spend any time trying to piece it together because it, you know, it doesn't really make sense to me. Because we were black, and we were treated that way. We moved to this little community where they were sharecroppers, so we became sharecroppers. Until, for the next 10 years, until my father saved enough money from his ministry to buy his own land. Now most blacks couldn't do that because many of them were illiterate. They couldn't read or write, and they were just forever in debt to the owner, to the landowner. But my father kept records and books, and we'd go to the gin, and I remember going to the gin with him, the cotton gin, to gin the cotton, and he would stand there and say, "How much is this bale weigh?" And then he'd come back, and he would get half of everything. So that's how he saved the money from that and from his preaching to buy our little 13 acres of land.
Wow.
Which was contiguous with the land owned by the whites. And that's the interesting thing there. It wasn't that you had a little piece of land off over in some place that nobody could find you. Blacks lived here, whites lived there, so forth and so on. And this county, unfortunately, at first they supposedly had 3 school systems. They supposedly had a school for the Cherokee people or the Native people, which went through the 7th grade. And then for us, we could go through the 11th grade, but that was to keep you from going to college. You had to go through the 12th grade to get into college, okay? It was all designed. It was a plan. First, we could go through the 8th grade. Then, when more enlightened people said, well, we need high schools for our black kids. And some of the whites pitched in and said, yes, but we only went through the 11th grade until the 40s. And so that's why the black colleges had high schools. So you could do your 12th grade year at Talladega had a high school, all these other schools. Fisk had one.
And it was just part of the campus.
You could do your 12th grade while you were doing your freshman year.
I never knew that.
Yeah, so it was, all the system was set up for failure. Make sure you were defeated from day one. But if you were smart enough, you could figure it out, because it wasn't really very smart. The system wasn't very smart. So by the time I came into high school, we could go through 12th grade. And so that's why you had some private schools also, like in Asheville you always had through the 12th grade in the cities, but not in the country. Because the assumption was you're going to be on the farm all your life.
Well, what did you think you were going to be when you grew up? Did you think you would be a preacher like your dad?
No, I'm sure they wanted me to be a preacher because, see, my father's father was a preacher. He had the equivalency of a 3rd grade education, but as I said, he taught school, he preached, he wrote so beautifully,
How did he learn how to write like that with the third grade education?
On his own, just kind of pioneering and engineering on his own. And my father had a very beautiful handwriting. He went through the 6th grade, he and my mother. But he would write off to these writing houses, Palmer Method and so forth, and get the books, and they want you to enroll in the courses. He would get the sample books, but he'd never. So he'd sit down and practice. I remember this company in Chillicothe, Ohio,
Okay.
in the 1940s, and he would write and get the penmanship book, and then I would take the book and practice it. So that was a part of not just the Palmer method, but that was a part of my learning to do all the fancy writing and what have you.
Well, tell us, what do you think were the important values that you got? I mean, you have a pretty diverse family background, and people know things from different cultures in different places, different skill sets. What would you say were the important values in the house?
Well, first, foremost was religion.
Okay.
And second was the extension of religion, do unto others as you would have them do unto your family values. And then thirdly was lifting yourself up out of the condition, getting an education. When I said, when I was like 6 years old, when we moved to North Carolina when I was 5. But when I saw all this hard work of plowing and picking cotton and farming and so on, I said, I'm not going to be a farmer. And so my father said, the way out of this then is through education. Get an education, you won't have to be. So I set my sight on being a teacher from day one, because they were the most highly respected people in the community, not the preachers. We didn't have any doctors or lawyers. We were 20 miles from a town where there was one black doctor or one lawyer, so we didn't know about them. And we didn't go to any doctors anyway. Well, I did later on, because my mother was kind of like an herbalist. She knew all the herbs, and I'd follow her around in the woods, and this is what you get for this. This is what you get when you have a cold. This is what you get, and so on. So we were 20 miles from the nearest doctor. So if you got a cold, there were no telephones, anything like that. You go to the woods, and you find, you get, first of all, the pine needles, which, interestingly enough, had all kinds of chemicals in them, turpentine and stuff like that. You boil that, and then you would add to it what we call horse mint, which was a mint that grew in that part of the world. And you'd add honey or whatever. Hardly anyone had a lemon, so if you had a lemon, you'd add the peel or something like that. But you'd make your compound for the cold, and that was to help cure the cold. I still do it, and it works.
Wow.
Later on, I learned you add cherry bark to it, and they would sell to the medicine men who would come around collecting. We just called it medicine stuff. The bark from the cherry tree, you get so much bark. If you got a pound, you could have $1.
Wow.
$1 would go a long way in 1940. And what we call the maypop, which was really the passion flower, the wild passion flower. We'd gather those, and they'd come and buy those, big bags of it, and they ship it off to wherever they make their medicine. But we knew all of that, and we'd use it there at home. So,
considering that, I'm wondering if you feel you got Your first exposure to the natural world through your mother and her medicinal trade there.
Definitely. And I'm sure that some of that, it wasn't just the African experience, some of it was the native experience, which they shunned away from. If you say, do we have any cousins over there with the Ripleys? No. We're black. It was that kind of. Now everybody wants to be, I got an Indian cousin. Well, you better not say that back then. And when we try and ask about Africa, no, don't know anything about Africa.
Do you think that was true?
Oh, they knew. It had been passed down. They knew things, but they somehow or another, I think, felt that this, whatever they call the African thing, and I even heard Aaron Douglas say, this African thing, that was holding them back. That people, the whites, who would have perhaps accepted them, that African thing kind of was working against them. So they didn't want to pass that on to us. And here I am later trying to learn as much as I can about it. And they're like, don't ask me nothing about it. I don't know nothing about that. On Good, for example, I say, Good, why's your name Good? She said, because I'm good. And just instead of saying, I'm Good Cloud, he's Sad Cloud, like Sad on Cloud, she's Sweet Cloud, and of course Grandma Eugenia was Honey Cloud.
Oh.
And so we call her Grandma Han.
What was your mother's name?
My mother, by that time, she's the last in the last five. They had pretty much given up. They had nicknames then. They had given up. She was Dude, and the sister after her was Dit, and the little sister was Boog. And so they'd given up these kind of names.
Are those the given names, or those are the nicknames from the given names?
Nicknames. Mary Lou was my mother's name.
Okay.
So she was Dude. Aunt May Ethel, was Dit. And Aunt Annie was Boog. So.
Okay. Okay. So I want to turn to art a little bit in these early years, thinking about what kind of exposure you had to art, because you were going to school.
In a one-room segregated school.
In a one-room segregated school in North
2 miles from
Carolina.
here.
Okay. And you were walking to school.
Yes.
Okay. But you had all this creativity in your family. I mean, even the nicknames.
And at school, Miss Freeman, Miss Edna Freeman.
Okay, well, did you learn anything about art? I mean, today.
We didn't call it art.
Okay, tell me what did
My
you
father
do?
made most of our furniture.
Wow.
My mother made all of the girls, the sisters' dresses and things, for the most part, from some from those flour sacks that would be decorated. When you get, if you buy a 50-pound sack of flour, it would have flowers on it or butterflies and things. So she'd save them and make the girls' dresses. If you look at the paintings of William H. Johnson, you see all those little decorated. Those are like from those dresses that the kids wore in those days. And they were made from flour sacks. And in many cases, all they do is cut a hole up there and cut a hole here. And then you got your dress. You see, it was make do.
Right.
Practical, make do. And you wore your clothes until you wore them out. You washed them at night, hang them by the fireplace to get dry, put them right back on the next morning, back and forth, back and forth. You couldn't go out of that house unless you were clean. Cleanliness and all of that. You had to have breakfast, you had to eat. Now, you grew most of your food. So.
But you didn't have a garden when you were in Eatonton.
Not in Eatonton.
But you had one when you were
in
in North Carolina. Okay.
From 6 years old on.
Okay.
So everybody had gardens then. And you grew all of your vegetables during the regular season. Then you learned how to heel your potatoes and put them away for the winter, and how to put the turnips and cabbage and things in if you had a cellar. Otherwise, you do a heel. And I did a drawing for somebody to show them what the heel was, where you put the potatoes in with corn stalks and things, and they keep all winter. And you just go in and get your potatoes.
And that's all in the cellar? I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, that really, they did some of it in the African tradition, but that really was a Native American thing. But it wasn't limited to African Americans. Everybody did it.
Well, so tell me again now, you didn't call it art in school, but what were you making in school?
Well, our teacher was enterprising in that sense that she had us making, first we had to copy things.
Okay.
I remember in the 4th grade, I copied an entire book.
What kind of book are you copying?
This was a children's book on health. Sleepy Town Wakes Up.
Okay.
So I did all the illustrations.
Okay.
And then the penmanship and so forth. But we also went out and dug clay from nearby banks and brooks and things, and we made fruits. We made apples, bananas, all of the things, some of the things we didn't get. We seldom saw a banana, but we knew what it looked like. We made bananas, we made oranges. We got oranges for Christmas only once a year. 1 or 2 oranges in our little basket for Christmas, and a couple of apples. But we could get apples during the year because they grow around. But orange was very special. Raisins were very special. Brazil nuts, very special. Pecans, pretty ordinary because the trees grew around. Black walnuts, ordinary. And we'd sit by the fireplace, and this hearth, as we called it, where the rocks would extend out from the fire, with a hammer or with a rock, and we'd crack the black walnuts, and that was a treat to sit there and pick the walnut out with a nail or something. We would porch the peanuts, not roast them, but porch. And that everybody had peanuts growing. So you'd have bushels of peanuts stored in the storage area, and you would bring them in the big pans and put the pan over the fire, and that was porching. P-O-R-C-H. Porch. Never heard of it?
I've never heard that. I've heard poach. I've heard roast.
No, but porch. P-O-R-C.
So you heat the butt, and then, but you still have to crack them open. You peel them open.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Afterwards, you open them up and eat them. And we play games with them. We had games. We play how many there was a game, so how many miles, and you'd have to guess how many peanuts you had in your hand.
Okay.
If you guessed right, you'd get the whole thing.
Oh.
If you guessed wrong, you had to give whatever you had.
No.
So sometimes you'd have a whole pile of peanuts, and so forth. Well, there was no television, no radio, no. It was creative.
That's a good game. No, I like that.
Yeah, it was very creative.
It's high stakes.
And we porched the potato. We put the sweet potato in
Oh, okay.
and covered it with ash, and we put the pone of, we said pone, P-O-N, of bread in,
Okay.
and covered it with ash, and it would bake brown and beautiful, and you'd blow the ash off and eat it. And
That's nice. And is this the whole family or just you and your sisters?
the whole family.
The whole
It was
family.
tradition,
Yeah.
because very few people had wooden stoves. They had fireplaces. Usually
Okay.
just one fireplace in what would be the living room. Really wasn't a living room, and no heat in the bedrooms.
Okay.
And
And
a
everybody-
cook stove in the kitchen.
Oh, okay. Separate from the fireplace.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I want to hear more about this, but I want us to talk about art because we've got a long way to go.
Well, the art was there, but we didn't call it art. My mother made baskets
Okay.
from sweetgrass, bulrush, and things like that. And she'd say, save all the boxes, meaning matchboxes and anything else that came in round. And then she would work this sweetgrass and stuff around it. And we didn't keep any of it, of course, because we wanted store-bought things.
Right.
And as I said, my father made much of the furniture.
And so, did you ever learn any furniture making or help him while he was doing those things?
I knew how to do it, and I've done a little of it, but I have a couple of things around here. But I have one box that he made out in the hall.
Really? And then you have things that you've made.
No, most of the things that I made are at the place in Maine.
Okay. And so you were copying these books at school. You were making these clay sculptures.
And we were making the clay sculptures, they were big, thick things, and painting them with enamel paint.
Oh.
And we were making the airplanes out of shingles. And we would have, at the end of the year, school would be out the end of April, early May, because it was based on when you go to the fields. And but we had what we call commencement.
Okay.
It had nothing to do with graduating. Commencement was at each school, or if you combined it together, it would be 3 or 4 schools coming together. And these are all the little one-room black schools. And in that county, we only had 2 brick schools. That was big. 3 rooms, brick school, with a little one room that could be called an auditorium. So we'd go there for the commencement from all over the county. We'd have to drive down there. No school buses. Whites had buses, but we didn't. And we would meet there once a year at the end of April. And we would have commencement. Spelling bee, showing off your art,
Okay.
and recitation,
Okay.
reciting poetry and speaking and so forth. And we'd go to Cliffside, which was one of the few Rosenwald schools.
Okay.
I think we had 2 Rosenwald schools in the county. But I know Cliffside, this brick building, was a Rosenwald school. We'd go there for our commencement. And it was down near the South Carolina line. So we always looked forward to that because it was about 20 miles away. And we'd get to ride all the way over there.
And so did you do all of those things? You did the resuscitations and...
I did all of them. I was never in the spelling bee, but I did, I recited poetry, and cowards die many times before their death. The valiant of teach of death but once. All the wonders I've heard have seemed to me most strange that men should fear death.
Okay, who is this? Who are you reciting?
Shakespeare.
Oh, see?
So we had good teachers.
Well, you know that and I don't, so yes.
And the thing that is seldom known or written about is, in the South, obviously, black teachers couldn't go to the University of North Carolina.
Sure.
Couldn't go to Duke. Couldn't go to the major school, Wake Forest, and so forth and so on. But but there were 11 black colleges in North Carolina accredited. So we had to learn all about the black colleges. What are the black colleges? Where are they? When were they founded? And so forth and so on. And so we knew all of that. We had to learn where all of the private high schools were in North Carolina.
Why was that important?
Sedalia and Lincoln Academy, which was the nearest one to us, a congregational school in Kings Mountain. If you were affluent enough and, quote, bright enough, you could go there.
As a black student, you could go to those. Okay.
And those kids were just automatically going off to college. But our teachers said, go to college. They couldn't go to those schools in North Carolina, but the state would pay them to leave the state. They had to. And they'd go to Columbia, to Michigan. I had a teacher in the 4th grade who had a master's from Michigan State University.
So they got Southern funding to go to schools in the North?
Yes. So we had excellent teachers. In some cases, our teachers were better than the white teachers because they had gone to the better schools.
Now, who was paying them to go to the North?
The state had to pay them.
Why did they have to pay them?
Because they wouldn't let them go to the University of North Carolina. They spent more money sending them away when they could have educated them right there.
Okay. That's
That
why
was
I'm
part
having
of
a hard time. The
part of-
logic of that is just...
Well, there was no logic, but it was segregation
Right.
and Jim Crow. And
Okay.
another little story that relates to all of this is, and I still use this principle of fishing, when I go to my place in Maine, of a brook that runs through the place, and there are trout in the brook, and I fish with a bamboo pole. And my father took me fishing with him on the Second Broad River, which is the nearest river to us, when I was 7 years old. And my Grandma Han, we stopped by Aunt May's. Grandma Han lived with Aunt May. And Grandma Han picked me up, put me on her knee, and she looked at my hands, she turned them over, and she said, George, my dad's name was George Washington Driskell. He never used that. He always said G.W. He said Washington never freed his slaves, and he was not going to have that name. So, so everything is Reverend G.W. Driskell.
Okay.
You know? So she said, George, she says, you send this boy to school because he's not going to be a farmer. And she, turned my hands back and forth. This was Grandma Han. And he had taken me fishing on the Broad River. And we had these bamboo poles. And he said, now this is the way you catch a fish. And he said, you put the bait in, the worm, and you let it float around to find out where the fish are, and they're going to bite. He said, don't try and pull him out. He said, when you feel the bite, let it go, let him have it. Make him think that he has it. Then jerk it right up. That's the way I fish today on my little brook in Maine, and I catch 10, 12-inch trout out of there.
Wow.
People come, they can't catch. They say, I can't catch anything down. Even my daughters, when they come, they go fishing, they can't catch a thing. They say, they only bite for you. I said, no. There's a technique to it. So Grandma Han, after coming back, she looked at my hand. She said, this boy's not going to be a farmer. George, send him to school. So I had all of this thing about I'm special.
Really?
Go to school. The teacher, I knew by the time I was 7 years old, I wanted to be a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And that was what I was aiming to be, I knew he wanted me to be a minister, because he was successful in a way. But I said, well, this is my ministry.
I like the way you phrase that. Did your family support your interest in art?
Oh, yes, they did, because they were, see, I was the first person, period, in my family. Of all of those, Aunt Good, Uncle Sat, Aunt May, and all of them, none of their children went to college.
Wow.
I'm the only one. So they kind of, oh, David's smart, David's so-and-so, you know, kind of focused in on me.
Well, I can see how there might be pressure being the first to go to college, that art might not be serious enough, or you might not make a living, so...
Well, I did have an uncle, Aunt May's husband, Uncle Roosevelt. He said to, and I overheard this, I guess I wasn't supposed to hear it, but he said to my dad, he said, that boy's smart. He said, if he was my child, my son, I'd make a doctor out of him. And my daddy said, no, he's going to be somebody, don't worry about it.
Wow. And so I'm wondering a number of things. When did art come into focus for you? Because I wonder if it's because in high school, or was it later going to college that something happened that made you want to be an artist? Do you remember going to a museum for the first time? Was that much later? Or did you meet an artist and go to the studio?
Well, I had to do, when the word got around amongst the teachers that I could draw, that was, oh, he can draw.
Is this in elementary school or high school?
Elementary and high school.
Okay.
We had no junior high.
Okay.
I would bus 35 miles a day past about 5 white schools to go to this little 4-room black school. So.
Is this Grahamtown?
That's Graham.
Okay.
Actually, because I lived in Cleveland County, but I was bused those 35 miles into Rutherford County. I had to get up at like 4 o'clock in the morning to walk a mile to get to the bus stop, and then ride 35 miles there and 35 miles back.
And this is 5 days a week?
5 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And by that time, we were through the 12th grade.
Right.
And that was Grahamtown in Forest City, North Carolina.
And what about, did you take art classes there?
There were no art classes.
So how did you become who you are? I mean, that's what this is all ultimately about. And you had so many choices. People believed in you.
Well, the word got around that I could draw. That was the catchphrase.
Did you
David
do this
can draw
on your own at home since you didn't have classes?
Well, you'll see a little drawing my father did. We used to draw.
Okay.
Everybody did a little drawing of some sort, but you didn't call it art.
Right.
And so, but the word got around. David can draw, and there were only like 2 other fellows, no girl that they said that about, but 2 other fellows in the so-called high school. Lee Lynch, who was Cherokee, real Cherokee, but had to come to our school to get an education because they went through his 7th grade. And he met a very good friend of mine who lives here in Maryland now.
Wow.
And Billy Thompson could draw. And we were kind of jealous of each other because Billy drew cartoons and characters and things. I didn't like cartoons and characters. Didn't draw them well, so I didn't find it. Lee drew almost anything. He was so talented. He never admitted that he was Cherokee because, well, there would have been a conflict. Here's this Indian boy at this black school.
Was he passing for black?
Yeah.
Oh, he was passing for black.
He had to. He and his sister was in my class, but he was like a year ahead of me. And you see him and you know, I mean, there's just no question. He didn't look like me, you know? But that was the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And Cool Spring High School, less than a mile from the four-room school that we had, they told there was over 60 rooms at that school. You know, and but we couldn't go over there.
Right.
So the word got around at Grahamtown High School that I could draw. So I would have to draw things for the plays and background.
Oh.
And I'd have to draw something for the newspaper. I'd have to draw for this and that and so forth. And but I wasn't gonna be an artist. My father had taken us as a family to the home of one of his deacons. By then he's a Baptist minister.
Mm-hmm.
White Oak Spring Missionary Baptist Church. Deacon Eddie Robinson did watercolors.
Really?
I had never seen anybody doing watercolors.
Okay.
And we went to his home for dinner, maybe around 1946 or 47. And I saw all these landscapes. And I'm like, oh, this is beautiful. Who did this? Who? And his daughter was a grade ahead of me at high school. And it was Leatrice. She said, oh, these are my dad's. He paints. And he always wanted to be a lawyer. But he was a farmer. He owned about 50 acres of land.
Oh.
And he had about 5 children.
And he was a deacon.
And he the people would go to him for advice about law, and he wasn't a lawyer, but he studied
Okay.
on his own. But he had these beautiful watercolors. I wonder what happened to them.
Would we like to pause?
Oh,
Yeah.
Let's pause. Okay, we are back from a break. We were just talking about your father's deacon and him being a watercolorist.
So was that the first time that you met an artist, someone that you would think, and maybe he thought of himself as an artist?
First time I'd seen some art that I could identify with a person.
Okay.
And in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And all this other stuff we were doing, we didn't call it art. My mother quilted. She did strip quilting and things like that. And I was just telling somebody there are a couple of pieces in the show in New York kind of dedicated to her in search of my mother's art. Big wall hanging canvases, no frame. And I was explaining to someone about that work. I said, when I was a little boy, she would quilt and I would want to quilt. She said, no, boys don't quilt. So as soon as I became an adult, I started quilting.
Really? I didn't know that.
And in Julie's book, you'll see a quilt with masks.
Okay.
And that was one of my first quilts. I think the first kind of quilt wall hanging I made that I was satisfied with was around 1963 or something
Okay.
like that. And then the quilt came a little later. But anyway, that we didn't call it art,
Right.
We wanted things from Woolworth
Right.
and Crest and places like that.
So I want to talk about transitioning from high school to Howard University, and I want you to tell the story about going to Howard, but also a little bit before that, why you decided to go to Howard, and you at that time were still planning to become a teacher, and you were going to major in history.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did you know about Howard? Was that one of the schools that you learned about for commencement and recitation, and was it part of that education in
Well,
high
we
school?
weren't required to learn about schools outside of colleges outside.
Okay.
However, they were a couple of students ahead of me at Grahamtown who came to Howard.
Oh.
And they came back, really, the one student that I knew came to Friedman's Hospital to study nursing, which was a part of Howard at the time. And she came back talking about Howard University.
Okay.
So she said that was the best Negro college in the world. And so I said, well, I got to go to the best. Then I looked and I don't have that kind of money. So I applied to Shaw University in Raleigh. Got accepted. One of my buddies from another school down in the other county was going, Isaac, got accepted. And so I was very proud. I got accepted. I got a $90 a year scholarship. And I was going to work in the art lab.
Now, how did that happen?
Well, I must have put down history and art.
Oh, okay. Now, how far would $90 take you? What
Well,
would
that would have paid for probably half of my tuition the first semester.
Okay.
Because when I arrived at Howard, my tuition for the first quarter was $33. It was going to be more money, but I didn't have it. I had worked, I'd gone to Asheville that spring to see my youngest sister, Georgia, who was working as a domestic, a live-in domestic. And she gave me $50 toward my college education. And I came back and I plowed the fields all summer and chopped the cotton and so forth. And I made an additional $45. So I bought a few little clothing and a trunk about so big, ready to go to Shaw. And Aunt May, again, Aunt May Ethelhill, rest her soul in peace. She loved me dearly and thought I was the brightest child around. She and Aunt Annie would say, oh, he's so smart. I'm just so afraid his head's going to burst open. He's got so much knowledge in it and so forth. My mother never thought that way, but they did. And Aunt May organized a little party, going away party. David's going to Shaw. You all come. We had our little games, throw the rubber band onto the bottle and all of that.
Yeah.
No television, no, none of that kind of crazy technology and stuff. Had a great time. She was an excellent cook. We had potato salad, banana pudding, and all kinds of things. Several friends came, written up in the little local Shelby Daily Star, local news of the colored folks. And so Mrs. Gleaves wrote, David Driskell is heading off to Shaw University, and so forth. Well, that night at the party, I announced, no, I'm not going to Shaw, I'm going to Howard.
Oh, no.
Didn't have any money, but I'm going to Howard. So my mother and father came, they brought me down, brought my little bag and stuff with me to Aunt May's, because Aunt May was the entrepreneur of the family.
Okay.
She pushed everybody out there, said, do it, And so we hugged and kissed goodbye, and they went on back 10 miles back up in the mountains to our little place. And the next morning, I announced to Aunt May, I'm going to Washington, because I had two sisters in Washington.
Okay.
I'm going to Howard. So, and then I said, oh, I don't know, I'm not going to college. She said, you leaving here. You are getting out of here. You're going somewhere, you're not going to stay here. So she went up the road. Here again, now they were sharecroppers. She went up the road to George Jones's house, who was the next landowner from where they lived. And she said, I want you to take my nephew to Kings Mountain. Here's $3. Now this is about 25 miles.
Okay.
That's the nearest train that goes north, which would be what is Amtrak now. So, Mr. George Jones He had a brother named Jesse. They lived on Jesse's property. But Mr. George, he had an old Model A with 2 seats, you know, sedan type. So I put my trunk in the back and I piled up in the front seat, and we clacked up down the road to Kings Mountain, and got there around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the train came around 6:30. Got my ticket to Washington, which was took $11.45 of my earnings, and I arrived the next morning. My sister Jean, who was born in 1924, the oldest, she lived at 309 A Street Northeast, 2 blocks east of the Supreme Court building.
Okay.
On 8th Street, right across the street from the Frederick Douglass house.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know that. They didn't know it was Frederick Douglass house.
Really?
No, nobody knew the history of those areas. And I arrived, knocked on the door, and they were all, you know, family happy. Oh, so happy. My brother-in-law said, "Oh, you came to get a job?" I said, "No, I came to go to college." Of course, another mouth to feed, the extended family. But they were so generous and kind, and okay. The other brother-in-law came and took me down to the head company and said, "You got to get a job." And he got a job because he was working there. And I got a job filling the things, the clothes, and then they'd send them over to the store and all that. Well, and I'm going to end it after this because I know this.
No, go ahead.
After that, 2 days I'm there, and they take me to church, and they go to this little fundamentalist church. Anyway, go to church, and they pray over me, and we come back, and brother-in-law said, "Well, I'm going to take you to get the job," and so on and so on. And I went down with him, put in the application. The next day I went up to Howard.
And they did not know you were coming.
Pardon?
No one at Howard knew you were
Oh,
coming.
no. School had been in session 3 weeks.
Okay, I just want to clarify. At this party for Brother David Goes to Shaw, you announced, "I'm not going to Shaw, I'm going to Howard."
I'm going to Howard.
Now, what possessed you to just, I mean, you didn't have a plan. You didn't have, you hadn't applied. You had not been accepted.
No, I knew Howard was the best school. I wanted to go to the best.
Okay.
And Howard's calendar was ahead of the Shaw calendar. So when I arrived in Washington, the school had been in, they had had a week of orientation, then 2 weeks of classes. And so this is September now, and I arrived on campus.
Is this 1949 or
1949.
Okay.
And the next day after I get to D.C., I'm not worried about this job, anything like that. I'm going to Howard. So my report card in my hand, I go up to Howard. And I asked, where do I go to sign up? I didn't know we had to register and all that. I said, I'm here to sign up for classes. And they said, you have to go to the registrar's office and find out. Registrar, okay. I go to the registrar's office. Dr. F.D. Wilkerson was the registrar. And his office was like over there. But you come into this larger office and the ladies were in charge. And so there was a lady there. I don't remember her first name, but her last name was Miss Fox, F-O-X. She kind of realized I was from Mars or someplace. And so she kind of kept an eye on me and everything. And I had this report card. I was class salutatorian, and I'm here to go to school, go to Howard. And they were like, well, you don't just come to Howard, you don't come to school, young man. You make an application. I said, I'm here, give me one. So by that time, Dr. Wilkinson comes out, and he says, young man, where are you from? Where are you from? And I told him, I said, where I'm from in Appalachia. He said, no, nobody comes from there. It was like that you couldn't be from there because nobody ever leaves, which was almost true.
Mm-hmm.
So they said, you have to make an application and all that. I said, well, I'm here, give me one. And they say, well, you know, there's a process. You do this, you do. And what about money, payment? I said, I don't have any money. You know, like, gotta have money to go to college? My teacher said, go to college, and I'm here. And so, Miss Fox, bless her soul, Miss Fox looked as though she was inebriated all the time. But she obviously had the students' interest in her. She said, young man, come, let me tell you. She said, school has been in session for 3 weeks. You can't just come and go to school. You so and so. She gave me a long. She said, now listen, if you listen to me, I'll help you. She looked at my report card. She said, well, we gotta have a whole record. We can't just go on this card. But I was a class salutatorian. And she said, we're on the quarter system. I didn't know what that meant. She said, we'll end in December and we'll start up again in January. She said, if you will take this application, fill it out, send it back to me, I'll make sure that it's received and reviewed and you can come in January. And I said, no, that didn't satisfy me.
Oh, no.
I want to go to college now. And so I took the application, but I wouldn't fill it out. And I just went on to classes. I found out what history was, and I just went and started sitting in this history class. Marie V. Wood. And Miss Wood must have known that I wasn't enrolled in that class because she wouldn't allow me to take exam. But she never asked me to leave.
Okay.
And I say, when I'm telling the story in brief form, I say, you know, I love Howard. It's my school in so many ways, but then I get angry. There's so many potentials in Howard, and they just seem to pass them up. And I'll say to non-Howard graduates, I said, I can talk about them and all that, but don't you? If you talk about them, you're going to be in trouble, because that's they didn't call security on me.
Right.
They must have seen something in me. I was that persistent.
You were confident. You probably acted like you belonged there.
Yeah, I had already bought my wardrobe, and I was
But you
ready.
had no money. You were late. 3 weeks late.
3 weeks late.
So did you go for the rest of that quarter, and did you eventually
Oh yeah, I
apply?
went and sat in on different classes and wrote home and told my parents, I said, I'm in college. And they believed me.
And you were telling the truth.
Well, and my
You
dad
were
getting up in the pulpit and said, David's in college.
And you were physically in college. You just was not enrolled.
So the second quarter, which was around March or something, I did enroll.
Okay.
And that was the beginning. And I was going to be a history major.
Mm-hmm.
And I majored. And I didn't pay the advisors any attention. I went and started taking these advanced courses in history. The very beginning.
Did you know anything about history from high school or in your family, or?
No, just had this great desire to want to be a social science and history teacher.
Okay.
And minor in art, perhaps. But the art thing didn't come until later.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even decide to go over and take an art course until a year and a half later.
So how did that happen? How did you transition from history to art?
Well, I was...
Did you double major, or you switched entirely to art?
I had enrolled in history courses, were doing well. At least getting C's.
Okay.
And I was taking the other courses that I should have taken from day one.
Right.
I started taking those. Freshman orientation. I was terrible when it came to English and that kind of thing. You had to pass the English comprehension examination. I had to take English 1 3 times before I got to. I had a teacher, Miss Coleman, who was from the old school, and we'd see Miss Coleman in the hall. We'd wear our hats all day in those days. And I remember see Miss Coleman in the hall and say, "Good morning, Miss Coleman." Miss Coleman turned her head to her. She said, "I don't speak to gentlemen with hats on. You have to take your hat off, you know." And but English, she taught. I took English from her. I took
Three times with the same person?
Times with the same person.
Okay.
Because I was my vocabulary was just limited. And that's what a lot of it was about.
Okay.
Then I had another friend from Georgia who, he just died last year. And we both enrolled at the same time, kept up and everything. And he was so brilliant. He just went right on in and took the course and just kept going. And there I was still taking English 1 over again. And they wouldn't give you a grade like A, B, C. They'd give you U for unsatisfactory or S. So our thing was, are you still in the U.S.? You know. But to make a long story short, I started taking these history courses.
Yes.
And I decided in my second year, 1951, that I would, because I enrolled in January 1950.
Right.
That properly. And so I was going to minor in art, so I'd go and start taking an art course. So I went over to Driskell Hall, where the art department was located on the 3rd floor, and I took a drawing course from Professor James Wells.
Oh, wow.
And I was drawing and everything. And I guess I was doing pretty good. And one day, in walks a gentleman, very well dressed, and he looked over my shoulders and he said, "What is your name?" "I don't know you." And I said, "David Driskell." He said, "I haven't seen you here before. Is this art your major?" I said, "No, history." He said, "You don't belong in history, you belong here." It was James Porter. And so I said, okay, I went and changed my major.
Immediately?
Immediately.
Really?
Next semester.
Now, what was it? Was it something about him? Was it something about a potential for mentorship or?
Well, he impressed me so, the way he looked. You know,
Okay.
he was dressed like an Englishman, cufflinks and blah, blah, blah.
Wow.
And he spoke with such precision. And I'm like, I'd like to be like him. And in contrast to the chairman of the department who had come in and had seen me drawing, and I was using some color. And he stood there and looked, Professor Herring. He stood and looked at what I was doing. And I was painting and drawing a girl portrait. She had on a blue sweater. And, you know, like you see the wrinkles and so forth.
Right.
And he stood there and he looked at it. And he said, he pointed to the arm. He said, "You'll never paint a better seascape in your whole life than that." And then he walked away. And I was like, who is that old man?
Okay.
That was Professor Herring. And that's the way he taught. He would just embarrass you and come up and say things.
And that never improved? He was just...
Never. But he became one of our best friends. And he loved Thelma.
Yeah.
He loved the girls, and he would, every time we come to Washington, he'd give us something, you know.
Yeah.
And but he never praised anybody. He was Professor Porter's teacher. And everybody said, don't take Harry. Well, you had to take him for art appreciation, because he taught 126 was art appreciation.
Now, what kind of art did he appreciate? What did he think was good art?
He was a pretty decent painter now.
Right, yes,
You know.
yes.
He'd gone to Syracuse and had founded the art department at Howard in 1921. He came there to teach architecture, but then he graduated into founding the department. And Alma Thomas was his first
Yes,
student.
and the first graduate.
Yeah. And he was good, but you had to have patience and know him, because he would just say things that would scare you off.
Yeah.
And he would say, well, if you get intimidated by that, you don't need to be in art, because it's a hard field. And, you know, but...
For art appreciation, was it European masters of all kinds? Okay.
It was all of Helen Gardner, Art Through the Ages.
Yes. Okay. They're
No
still
black
using
art,
that
no
book.
African. Pardon?
And they're still using that book. You know,
Oh,
editions
yeah,
go
it's
on.
still,
But
yeah, and we'd go to class, and the chapel was right next door at Rankin Chapel to the classroom in Fountain's Library where he would teach, because his office was in Fountain's Library. And this is just anecdotally an example, but occasionally, you know, when somebody would die, and they'd have the funeral in the chapel, and we want to get out of class to go. We didn't know the person, of course, but we want to get out of class. And Mr. Herron would say, let the dead bury the dead. And we'd see Dr. Locke maybe the next day, and he said, you weren't at Dr. So-and-so's funeral. He was a very great man. Why weren't you there? We said, well, Professor Herron wouldn't let us come.
mm-hmm.
And Dr. Locke would say, like, well, too bad it wasn't Herring, or something like that. They hated each other's guts.
Did anyone like Locke?
Very few of them.
Yeah. Okay.
But it was equally bad on Herring's side.
Yeah.
Herring didn't like Locke, because Locke said that he founded the art
Oh,
department
I see.
at Howard, and Herring never forgave him.
But Locke was in philosophy, I
He was in
thought.
philosophy, but he really kind of created the spirit about art history,
I see.
because he was writing about it before Herring
Right.
was, you know.
Did he teach classes on art, or what kind of classes did Locke teach? If
He taught philosophy,
He
but
taught
he would
philosophy.
lecture in the humanities, and it would include some aspects of art.
Okay.
And
Did you take a class with him?
no class, but I had to go to Rankin Chapel every Friday when he lectured in the social sciences.
Okay. So what was that like? Did you
Weird,
like him?
weird. Well, not weird. He was very. These people were brilliant. They were, I say, landlocked at Howard.
Yeah.
They couldn't go any other place. So they were at each other's throat half of the time.
Mm-hmm.
This one didn't like that one. This one didn't like that one. But I thought I was going to get into history because of John Hope Franklin and you know, people like that. And but my advisor was not. I think Dr. Franklin was getting ready to leave or had just left, going to Brooklyn College. And my advisor was Harold Lewis,
Okay.
who had no great publishing record, but most of the people did.
Okay.
And he would let me kind of skip around and take whatever I wanted to take. So I was happy over there, but when I got an art, I had to go by the book. So that's, you know, how I got into the art thing. And I remember when Dr. Locke died in 1954. And Professor Herring would not sit with the faculty. He dressed up in a white suit and came in after the faculty had been seated and went up and viewed him and walked out. And I won't say what he was heard to have sang as he walked out.
No.
I told the so I would bury him.
Ooh.
They were landlocked.
Yeah.
They were there. They couldn't go any other place. They were brilliant people. They fought amongst themselves.
Well, why was it weird taking a class with him? What kind of lecturer?
Well, he would never teach from the book. You didn't know what he was going to be talking about the next day. He would say, read first 100 pages or something.
Okay.
And you think the test is going to be on that. The test was not on that. He'd just come up with something like, what's the most important thing you've read about locally about art? Well, nobody was reading about art. We thought he was going to come from this and he'd come from another angle.
Okay. Did he seem disorganized? Or
Oh,
preoccupied?
he was well organized. He knew his stuff. But he didn't ever want you anticipating him about anything.
Okay.
It's in the book. He said, read it so you'll know it, but don't expect me to go back over it with you.
So tell us what were your biggest, most helpful lessons of your time at Howard? Or I could be more specific if that's too big, but...
Well, I think I know what you... I think I learned the lesson of competency, that you couldn't be... you had to almost be first rate in everything to succeed. That you were still living in a segregated world. So you almost, it's like what my mother would say to me, my closest neighbor, Jimmy, who was white, Jimmy Lattimore. He lives in St. Louis now. He still stays in touch with me occasionally.
Wow.
And Jimmy's parents were teachers. They had gone to Appalachian State College. And like I said, my teachers had gone to Michigan State, Columbia, and so forth. So I'm sure I knew some things that Jimmy didn't know. And I would say, Jimmy got a C, and so she said, you can't get a C. You have to get an A. She said, Jimmy can get a C and go out here and do whatever he wants to, but you can't. You got to be better than Jimmy. I mean, she would preach that to me. So I think Howard kind of reinforced it. You had to be good or the best if you want to succeed in this field, because it's too competitive. There are too many good people out there. And one of my aims was to get on the good side of the teachers so they would help push me.
Okay.
And so there were a lot of ways of doing that. I drove a taxi.
I was just going to ask you, how did you pay tuition? And did you live with your sister still, or did you move out?
For the first part I did. I drove a taxi, and I worked part-time in the evening at an art store.
Okay.
And until I got married and moved out. By that time, I had kind of cultivated an aura of respect around what I was doing as a painter. I had won the first prize in the regional exhibition for the colleges. And they would have the regional exhibition was integrated. And I had won the first prize in 1952 in painting.
So let me ask you this. I want to talk about a couple of things, and then I know we're going to take a break. When you became an art major, what happened next? Did you have an idea that you were going to be a painter, or you were going to keep drawing, or did Porter give you real guidance and take you under his wing? And because now you're talking about winning prizes. So you were a history major getting C's. 2 years later, you're winning an art prize. can you talk a little bit about how that happened?
Well, in those days, I guess they had what they called teacher's pets. And Lois Jones would declare openly, David's my pet.
So she
irritate the rest of the students. She didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I worked so hard to be good, to absorb what I saw going. I was so grateful. Mm-hmm. I felt that I was so blessed to be there and to have that kind of chance and that opportunity. I savored the moment. I loved every moment of it. Mm-hmm. And I took the chance to absorb everything. We were driving past the library downtown. It's not a library any longer. I think it's the Historical Society building, 7th and K Street, Northwest. But Thelma and I had a little, what do you call it when it's just one room? Studio apartment.
A studio apartment? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, down New York Avenue, a block away from there. I literally lived in that library when I wasn't driving the taxi and in school. And I said to somebody the other day, and I called the gentleman's name, he said, how do you remember all these names? And I was like, well, Mr. Wilson, he took time with me. I would go in there, and I wasn't supposed to be able to take these plates. I would take out these plates of Cézanne, Renoir, and all these. I was supposed to leave the library. He let me take them home because he knew I was going to bring them back to study them.
So Mr. Wilson was a librarian.
Librarian.
And you had access to these art books, and he let you check them out, but they were supposed to stay in the building.
Right, supposed to take them out.
Was he black or white?
He was white. The books and what have you, and he knew I was serious. Mm-hmm. And he would say, wait until they leave, and then he said, you can take these and bring them back when you finish, and so on, things like that. So there were so many people kind of like rooting for me. And at the art store where I worked, and I walked in, I was looking for a job, and this is before driving. I didn't know how to drive at that time. And there was a gentleman standing outside of the door, like he was chain smoking, And I'm looking in the window at the paintings and so on. So he finally said to me, he said, you've been standing there looking at that painting for a long time. Do you paint? And I hadn't changed my major to art at that time. I said, yes, yeah. He said, well, what do you paint? What medium? And I didn't know anything about medium. I said, medium? He said, what do you use? What do you paint with? I said, crayon. And he looked at me like, this grown man, he paints with crayon. He said, you don't know about oil paints and things? I said, no. He said, well, come in the store, I'm going to give you a sample. And he gave me this little Italian man, his name was Luigi Sabatino. He gave me a little set of oils. Luigi was very effeminate. So he may have had other plans. I don't know.
Okay.
I was so naive, I didn't know what was going on in the world. But he was kind to me and he invited me in. He gave me this little set of oil paints. He said, these are oils and you can paint a picture like that with it. He said, when you paint that picture, you could bring it back to me. I took those oils and there was a light entrance to my sister's house. Glass shaped like that. You go in at 309 8th Street. I painted something on the light panel on the glass.
You did?
I did not paint a landscape or anything like that. I often wonder how long did it stay there in oil. And so I did go back. He said, did you paint a picture? I said, yes. He said, did you bring it back? I said, no. And he didn't say, well, bring it or anything like that. And I said, I'm looking for a job. He said, oh, you're looking for a job? And he said, you said you were in school. I said, yeah. And he wanted to know, was I studying art? I said, no. And he said, well, I have a very good friend who teaches art there, Lois Jones.
Oh, wow.
I hadn't heard anything about Lois Jones. I didn't know anything about any
So
of them.
you were what, 20, 21?
I was 20.
Okay.
Yeah. And so he told me about Lois, and he said, well, we just getting set up here and everything. He said, but we're going to need a porter. He said, can you do porter work? I said, yes. I didn't know what a porter was. And when I finally came in and he talked, he said, well, porter scrubs the floors and mops and cleans the bathrooms. I said, I can do that. Yeah, I can do that. So he introduced me to Mr. Ellering, Mr. Albert Ellering, who was the store owner. And Mr. Ellering said, can you drive? He said, we're going to need somebody to help us deliver. And I said, no, I can't drive.
I'm glad you said no, because you've been saying yes to everything.
Yeah.
And that becomes quite dangerous if you say
Yeah.
yes to driving.
Driving, I said, no. He said, well, I'll teach you to drive if we hire you. And he did. Mr. Ellering taught me to drive in the alleys, in back of the store, up and down, back in, his store was at 934 New York Avenue. So I drove from that end to this end, from 9th Street to 10th Street, back and forth, until I learned how to drive, and then he took me to get my driver's license.
What was the name of this art store?
Arts and Crafts Supply Company.
Okay.
Were they selling to professional artists or to
Yeah.
craftspeople?
Craftspeople and professional. This was the beginning of paint by the numbers and things like that. And GIMP and all that stuff that they worked with summer camps. And I had to, when I learned to drive, I had to deliver these materials to all these different places. And I'll tell you about delivering to a school, the only place in Washington in 1951, 52 that would have black kids in the classes. It was a woman, we thought she was Russian because of the name, but she wasn't. Mrs. Cornelia Uditsky. And she had a school over near 19th and I Street Northwest. Now we are at 10th and New York Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And I went there to deliver supplies after I learned to drive. And I saw this black kid in there, which was most unusual for Washington at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And a black kid with finger painting and all that stuff. And I'm 20, 21 years old. I'm like, well, who is he? Why is he here? And I learned later on that was Martin Puryear.
No. You are kidding. Okay, I think we need to take a break. We did not make it through, so we'll just take a break and then start back.
Yeah. Okay.
But I do want to know more about that.
All right, we'll see you back in a minute.